The officer looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I need you two to collect your things and leave, right now." His right hand was already drifting toward his holster. He had no idea my badge was clipped to my belt, less than 2 inches from his fingers. He had no idea Darius had been recording on his phone for the last 4 minutes. And he had absolutely no idea that the man who had called him in, the man sitting at the bar in the too tight sport coat, swirling his bourbon and watching us like we were a problem to be disposed of, was the same man Darius and I had been building a federal corruption case against for the past 6 months. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Darius and I had a tradition. Every time we closed a major lead on a case, not the arrest, not the press conference, just a solid, irrefutable lead that told us we were going to win, we went to Meridian Steakhouse on 5th Avenue. It wasn't the fanciest restaurant in the city, but it had been there since 1987, and the smell of the wood-fired grill reached you from half a block away, thick and warm like a hand on the shoulder. We'd been partners for 4 years, and in that time we'd made maybe a dozen trips to Meridian. Each visit felt like a quiet ceremony, a private acknowledgement that we were doing something right in a job that very rarely lets you feel that way. That particular Thursday evening in October, we had serious reason to celebrate. For 6 months, Darius and I had been embedded in a financial corruption investigation that threaded through 3 city precincts, 2 shell companies, and 1 very well-connected city councilman named Gerald Prentice. We'd started as background support, pulling surveillance footage, feeding documents upstairs. But the deeper we dug, the more we understood that the case was bleeding. Somewhere between our unit and the DA's office, information was escaping. Witnesses were recanting. Evidence logs were coming back incomplete. Darius had quietly started keeping a second copy of every document in the trunk of his car. I had started photographing every piece of paper I submitted before I handed it over. We trusted almost nobody. But we trusted each other, the way you only trust someone after they've had your back in a dark hallway at 2 in the morning and never mentioned it again. The lead we'd locked down that afternoon was a bank transfer. $47,000 moved through a dummy LLC directly into an account tied to Prentice's chief of staff. Clean, traceable, time-stamped. Our supervisor, Lieutenant Carver, had stared at the printout for a long moment without speaking, then slowly nodded once. "This is it," he said. That was all. It was enough. So we went to Meridian. Darius got there before me. When I pushed through the door, he was already at our usual table, back left corner near the kitchen, clear sightlines to both entrances, nobody able to sit behind us. Old habit. Occupational reflex. He was wearing a charcoal blazer over a gray shirt, no tie, and he looked like a man who had just exhaled for the first time in months. He was reading the menu, even though he always ordered the same thing. The 12-ounce ribeye, medium rare, creamed spinach, and a side of fries he pretended were for the table, but ate entirely himself. I sat down across from him, and for a moment we didn't say anything. We just sat in the warm amber light of that old restaurant and let the weight of the past 6 months loosen its grip, just slightly, just enough to breathe. "We're actually going to get him," Darius said finally, still looking at the menu. "We're going to get him," I said. He set the menu down and looked at me. "I want the ribeye." "You always want the ribeye. And yet every time I sit here I look at the menu, hoping something's changed." He smiled and I laughed, and it was the first time in a long time that laughing felt like something other than a reflex. Our waiter, a young guy named Daniel, who wore his tie slightly crooked and always remembered what we drank without asking, brought water and took our orders. Bourbon for me, neat. Sparkling water for Darius, who'd stopped drinking 2 years ago and never made a point of mentioning it. The restaurant was about 2/3 full that evening. Couples, a few business dinners, a large table near the front celebrating what looked like a birthday, people wearing paper crowns and taking pictures, the low, contented roar of a room where everyone is comfortable. I remember thinking, just for a second, that this was exactly the kind of evening I needed. One night where I could simply be a man having dinner with his partner, not a detective carrying 6 months of wire-tight paranoia under his skin. I noticed the man at the bar about 20 minutes into our meal. Mid-50s, heavy-set, in a sport coat that pulled across his shoulders. He was drinking something dark on ice and not talking to anyone. He was watching us. Not the idle glance and look away of someone curious about strangers. This was deliberate and calculated. He'd turn away whenever I shifted in his direction, but his reflection in the mirror behind the bar betrayed him. I caught it twice before I stopped pretending I hadn't. The third time I looked, he had his phone pressed to his ear, one hand cupped over his mouth, eyes still angled toward our table. I didn't say anything to Darius right away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that 6 months of working a leaking investigation had rewired my baseline until I saw threat in everything, that not every white man at a bar who watched a black table was calculating something, but the feeling sat in my chest anyway, low and steady, the way it always did when something was actually wrong. Not anxiety, but recognition. Darius noticed me noticing. "What?" he said, his knife moving through his steak. "Guy at the bar. Been watching us since we sat down." Darius didn't look up immediately. He chewed, set his knife down, reached for his water. "Sport coat? Too tight through the shoulders?" "Yeah. Clocked him when I came in." He paused. "You know him." "No. You." "No." He looked briefly with the practiced casualness of someone who has spent enough years not wanting to be seen looking. "He's on the phone now. Has been for a few minutes. We ate." The birthday table up front erupted into song. "Happy birthday," enthusiastic and off-key, a waiter carrying out a slice of cake with a sparkler. The room stayed warm, ordinary, comfortable on the surface. Underneath it, that pressure in my chest kept its slow, steady rhythm. 15 minutes later, Daniel appeared at our table with the expression I recognized immediately because I had worn it myself. The face of someone about to deliver news they didn't choose and don't endorse. He crouched slightly at the edge of our table, lowering his voice. "I'm really sorry," he said. "Mr. Kowalski, the manager. He's asked me to tell you that another guest has raised a concern." He paused, eyes dropping briefly to the tablecloth. "He said you were making other guests uncomfortable." The fork in my hand became very heavy. I set it down with a small, clean sound against the ceramic, and for a moment that sound was the only thing I heard. The birthday singing had wound down. The ambient warmth of the room seemed to flatten. "Which guest?" Darius asked. His voice was perfectly level, the way a frozen lake is level, smooth on top, dangerous underneath. Daniel glanced toward the bar and back. "The gentleman over there. I want you to know that I'm not the one saying this. I was told to pass it along." He exhaled slowly. "I'll get Mr. Kowalski." He walked away, and I watched him go. Then I looked at Darius. His jaw was set. Without a word, he picked up his phone from the table, opened the camera app, and propped it against his sparkling water glass, angled toward the entrance. "Recording." "Smart," I said. "Been at this long enough," he said. The manager, Kowalski, arrived quickly, a thin man in his early 60s with the carefully groomed look of someone who had spent decades apologizing for other people's behavior while framing it as policy. He rubbed his hands together as he approached, a gesture that managed to communicate both apology and dismissal simultaneously. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for the interruption. There's been a complaint has been made, and I'm afraid I have to—" "What complaint?" I said. "A guest indicated he felt that your presence was—" He stopped. adjusted his phrasing. Intimidating to other patrons. I understand how that sounds, and I'm not. We're eating dinner, Darius said. He set down his glass. We walked in, we sat down, we ordered food. What specifically did we do that was intimidating to anyone? Kowalski opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the table between us and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and all three of us understood that perfectly well. I'd like to speak with the guest who made the complaint, I said. Before Kowalski could respond, the front door of the restaurant opened behind me, and a voice cut across the room. Loud, deliberate, carrying the particular confidence of a man who has never had to lower his voice in public. All right, I'm going to need you two to collect your things and leave. Right now. I turned slowly. The officer was white, somewhere in his late 40s, with the wide build of someone who'd played football in high school and never quite let it go. He was in uniform, badge, holster, the whole presentation. And he was already moving toward our table, with his hand brushing the grip of his weapon, like the gesture was reflex, like it was nothing. The restaurant went quiet around him. The birthday table had stopped laughing. Daniel, standing near the kitchen door, had gone very still. The man at the bar in the too tight sport coat was watching all of this with an expression I would have called satisfied if I hadn't been so busy feeling the cold, crystalline focus that comes over me in the moments just before everything changes. I looked at the officer. I looked at the hand near the holster. I felt the badge on my own belt and the weight of 6 months of work and the $47,000 transfer and Darius's phone recording every second of this on the table beside his unfinished ribeye. And I said nothing. Not yet. I wanted him to keep talking. I needed him to keep talking. He stopped at the edge of our table and looked down at us, and his voice carried the flat, administrative tone of a man who expects no resistance. You two are disturbing the other patrons. I've received a complaint. I need you to leave the premises. We're in the middle of dinner, I said, very calmly. I'm not going to ask again, he said. The room was absolutely silent now. Every person in Meridian Steakhouse was watching, forks suspended, glasses held midair. A child at the birthday table peeked around her mother's arm, wide-eyed. Darius placed both his hands flat on the table, a deliberate, visible gesture of stillness, and looked up at the officer with an expression I knew well, the face he wore when he had already won and was simply waiting for the other person to figure it out. Officer, Darius said, before this goes any further, I think you should know something. The officer's eyes moved to Darius with the slow, irritated patience of a man who expects to hear an excuse. His hand was still near his holster. The birthday table had gone completely still. Even the kitchen sounds had faded, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I don't need to know anything, the officer said. He had a name tag, Brecker, and he said this the way men like him say most things, like the sentence was already finished before he opened his mouth. I need you to stand up, collect your belongings, and exit the premises. That's the end of it. Officer Brecker, I said, and the sound of his name made something flicker in his face. Just briefly, just a tightening around the eyes that told me he hadn't expected to be named. I reached slowly, deliberately, with the kind of exaggerated care you develop when you've spent years in situations where a sudden movement can redefine a moment in catastrophic ways. I reached to my belt and unclipped my badge. I set it on the white tablecloth between the bread basket and Darius's water glass, and I let him look at it. Detective Marcus Webb, Major Crimes Unit, and my partner. Darius had already placed his own badge on the table, corner to corner with mine, smooth and unhurried. Detective Darius Cole, same unit. The silence in the room changed texture. It had been the silence of held breath. Now it became something else. The silence of a room collectively recalibrating. Brecker looked at the badges. He looked at them for a long time, The hand near the holster drifted slowly back to his side. A vein in his jaw worked once, twice, and then went still. "You're—" he started. "We're having dinner," Darius said pleasantly. "We've been having dinner for approximately 40 minutes. We came here after work, as people do." He picked up his water glass and took a slow sip, watching Brecker over the rim. "Is there something we can help you with?" The man at the bar, sport coat, bourbon, phone, had stopped watching with satisfaction. His expression had made a hard turn into something I recognized as the early stages of a problem he hadn't anticipated. He was sitting very still now, the glass in front of him untouched, his eyes moving between us and Brecker with the rapid calculation of someone trying to find a door in a room that just locked. "Who called you in?" I asked Brecker. I kept my voice conversational, even friendly. "Who made the complaint?" Another pause. Brecker's eyes cut toward the bar, brief, instinctive. And then back to us. It was all I needed. "The gentleman at the bar," I said, not asking. "The one who's been watching us since we sat down." I turned, very slowly, and looked directly at the man in the sport coat. He held my gaze for exactly 1 second before his eyes dropped to his bourbon. "What's your name, sir?" He didn't answer. "I'd strongly recommend you answer that," Darius said quietly, "since there's going to be a report filed about this evening, and it's much better for everyone if the names in that report are accurate." The man's throat moved. He uncurled one hand from around his glass, and I noticed his fingers were pressing together at the tips, a gesture of barely controlled pressure. He said, with the stiff deliberateness of a man choosing each word the way you choose footholds on uncertain ground, "Raymond Holt, I'm a private citizen. I have the right to—" "Raymond Holt," I said. I let the name sit in the air between us. I watched his face, and in the 3 seconds it took him to look away again, something moved through my chest that was colder and more precise than anger. Because I knew that name. Not from across a bar, not from a social encounter. I knew it from a paper trail. Raymond Holt appeared twice in the shell company documentation we'd been building our case on, not as a primary figure, not as someone we'd focused on heavily, but as a name that surfaced on the edges of the Prentice network, a facilitator, a connector, someone who made introductions and received small transfers in return. I had photographed a document with his name on it 6 weeks ago, and I had filed it away in the back of my mind the way you file things you aren't sure you'll need, but don't want to forget. I looked at Darius. He looked at me. In 4 years of partnership, you develop a language that doesn't require words, and the conversation we had in that 3-second exchange was detailed and specific. He had recognized the name too. His eyes said, "Carefully." Mine said, "I know." I stood up from the table, not quickly, not dramatically. I buttoned my jacket, picked up my badge, clipped it back to my belt, and I walked to the bar. Raymond Holt watched me approach with the expression of a man who is trying to decide whether to run and understands that running would be the worst thing he could do. I sat down on the stool beside him. The bartender found something urgent to do at the far end of the bar. "Mr. Holt," I said, keeping my voice low just between us, "I want you to think very carefully about what you did tonight. You called in a uniformed officer to remove 2 men from a restaurant because you didn't want them sitting where they were sitting. You made that call. You set that in motion." I paused and let him fill the silence with his own understanding. Now, that might have gone differently tonight. A lot of things like this go differently. But they didn't, tonight, go differently, because of who we are. And now there's a record, and a report, and a camera that's been running for— I glanced back at Darius's phone, still propped against the water glass. "About 19 minutes. So I want you to think very carefully about what you'd like to happen next." His jaw was tight. There were small beads of perspiration along his hairline that had not been there 20 minutes ago. "I didn't do anything illegal," he said. His voice was steady, but thinner than it had been. I raised a concern to a manager. That's... You're right, I said. What you did tonight is between you and whatever you're able to live with. I leaned in slightly. But here's what I'll tell you, Mr. Holt, as one professional to another, in the interest of full disclosure. My partner and I know who you are. We've known your name for a while now, and the reason tonight is going to stay with you is not because of what happened in this room. It's because of what it tells me about where you think you are, and where you think we are. I stood up. Enjoy your bourbon. I walked back to the table. Darius had folded his napkin neatly and placed it beside his plate. He raised an eyebrow as I sat down. Anything good? He sweated, I said. They always sweat eventually. He flagged Daniel down. Can we get the dessert menu? I think we've earned it. The weeks that followed moved quickly. We filed the incident report that night, a formal documentation of what Brecker had done with Darius's video attached, witness statements from 3 patrons who left their contact information with us voluntarily, and a detailed account of Raymond Holt's involvement in initiating the removal. The Internal Affairs review of Brecker's conduct was opened within 48 hours, but that was in some ways the smaller of the 2 fires burning, because Raymond Holt's name went into a different file, our file, and once it was there, formally, on record, connected to a documented incident with 2 detectives from Major Crimes, Lieutenant Carver brought it upstairs. The federal contact we'd been working with, a sharp, unhurried woman named Agent Torres, who operated at a frequency of absolute calm that I had always found either reassuring or terrifying depending on the day, looked at Holt's name in the incident report, looked at where it appeared in the Prentice documentation, and sat back in her chair. He was trying to make you leave, she said. Yes, I said, before you could recognize him. That would be my read. She tapped her pen against the edge of the table. He knows something's moving, which means Prentice knows something's moving, which means someone is still feeding information from inside. She paused. The good news is, now we know who Holt is to this operation, and now we have him on something documented and time-stamped. She looked at me. He handed you leverage? He did, I said. The case broke open 3 weeks later. The financial transfers, the shell companies, the documents Darius had been keeping in his car trunk. All of it went to the federal grand jury. Prentice was indicted on 7 counts of corruption and 2 counts of obstruction. Raymond Holt, facing a separate investigation into his role as a financial intermediary and unable to distance himself from an incident involving 2 law enforcement officers that was now documented and public, negotiated a cooperation agreement within 10 days of being formally contacted. He gave up 3 names we hadn't had. One of them was the source of the leak inside our unit, a civilian administrator who had been passing case summaries to Prentice's office for 2 years in exchange for a city contract directed toward her brother's construction company. Brecker was brought before an internal affairs hearing 6 weeks after the night at Meridian. Darius and I testified. The video was entered into evidence. 3 of the witnesses from the restaurant appeared. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Beverly, who had been at the birthday table with her family and had filmed the entire incident on her own phone without telling us, submitted footage that showed the moment Brecker's hand moved toward his holster from an angle Darius's camera hadn't captured. Brecker's attorney argued procedural points with the focused urgency of a man trying to hold water in his hands. The board recommended suspension without pay and mandatory retraining. It was not everything. It was not nothing. The night the Prentice indictment was announced, Darius texted me at 11:15. 3 words. Meridian tomorrow night? I put my phone down on the kitchen counter, and I stood in the quiet of my apartment for a long moment, and I felt something that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite relief, but was something compound and specific that I didn't have a single word for. Something that had been wound very tight for a very long time, releasing degree by slow degree. I texted back, "Ribeyes on me." 4 months after that October evening, I walked into Meridian on a Wednesday night in late February, when the city was cold and the streets were lit with that particular blue-gray light of winter at dusk. Darius was already at the back table. Daniel came over without being asked and brought Darius his sparkling water, and me my bourbon, neat. The restaurant was full, warm, carrying the same low, comfortable roar it always had. Couples and business dinners, and a table near the window where someone was very earnestly proposing marriage, kneeling on the hardwood floor while his companion pressed both hands to her face. I looked around the room once. No one was watching us. There was no one at the bar in a too-tight sport coat running calculations. There was just the warm smell of the wood-fired grill and the sound of a room full of people having a normal evening, and us in our usual corner, the one with the clear sight lines, and nobody able to sit behind us. Old habits intact, unbothered. Prentice's attorney filed a delay motion today, Darius said. Third one. Judge denied it in about 4 minutes. 4 whole minutes, I said. She was generous. She really was. He picked up the menu and looked at it for a moment. I keep hoping something's changed. Has it? He set the menu down. Ribeye, he said. Medium rare. I raised my bourbon glass, and he raised his water, and we touched them together over the breadbasket without ceremony, without a speech, without anything that needed to be said out loud. The same quiet acknowledgement it had always been, that we were doing something right in a job that rarely lets you feel that way. Except this time it felt different. This time it felt earned in a way that went past a single case. This time the warmth of that room was just warmth, not contrast, not the lull before something broke. The sparkling water caught the light. My bourbon was exactly what it was supposed to be. Some evenings, that's enough. Some evenings, that's everything.